On 20th April 1947, Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort was raised to the altar by Pope Pius XII. It was 231 years after his death. Who is this person called Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort, who is invoked by so many, whose spirituality is so rich and followed by many men and women today? Louis-Marie, or commonly known as Montfort, was born in a small town, Montfort-sur-Mer, in France on 31st of January 1673. Although he was the second child, he became the eldest surviving children out of 8 boys and 10 girls. His eldest brother died during infancy. Although his father was a lawyer, but his profession was not enough for the upkeep of his large family. He was baptized a day after his birth at his home parish. Hence, he adopted the name Father de Montfort many years later. Soon, he was taken to a wet nurse called Mother Andre, a good farmer's wife of the neighborhood. His love of solitude and prayer grew when the whole family moved to Bois Marquet, a property in a Fendic parish. While in school, he proved to be a gifted pupil, full of courage and determination. His devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary was already seen when he was still a boy. Through the help of his uncle, who was a priest, he was enrolled to a Jesuit school in Rennes. While in school, he saw a poor student being bullied by other students. He took the initiative to collect some money from his fellow students. Then he took the poor boy and the money to a tailor. He said to the tailor, "He is my brother and yours. Here is some money for his clothes. If it is not enough, you have to make good of it." The tailor was impressed by Louis-Marie's attitude. He made 2 pairs of clothing for the boy instead of 1. His father was in full hope that Louis-Marie would become a lawyer, but soon he found out that his desire to be a priest was even stronger. With hesitant, he gave his blessing to Louis to become a priest. Through a kind lady, Louis-Marie saw his dream to be a priest becoming clearer. He made preparation to go to Paris, to Saint Sulpice Seminary. His mother gave him a new pair of clothes and a pack of food, while his father gave him 10 crowns for the journey. Louis-Marie chose to walk all the way from Rennes to Paris. After he crossed the Sesson Bridge, he met a poor man. He gave the poor man his new clothes, the money, and the food. A distance away, he met another beggar. He traded his own clothes with the beggars. From then, he chose to remain poor and surrender his journey to Our Lady, with full confidence to the divine providence. When he reached Paris, he presented himself to the kind lady who had promised him a scholarship to study at Saint Sulpice. The lady was skeptical about Louis because he was very haggard and dirty. She almost did not recognize him. She did not provide enough money for him to go to the seminary. Nevertheless, she helped him to lodge at a house for poor students while going to Sorbonne University. The priest in charge of the house accepted him. While in the seminary, his superiors saw his saintliness and diligence in studies. He was then moved to the Saint Sulpice Seminary. He was to charge the library, and he took all the opportunity to read as many books he could. He also undertook some art and sculpture. As a custom of the seminary, every year 2 seminarians were to make a pilgrimage to Our Lady's shrine at Chartres. He was chosen. He then set for Chartres with another seminarian by walking. When they arrived at the church, he went to the crypt chapel where the statue of Our Lady of Chartres was kept. He prayed on his knees for a long time. In 1700, at the age of 27, he was ordained priest. He said his first Mass at the altar of the Blessed Virgin in the seminary chapel, where he spent many hours in prayer and keeping the altar clean. Louis-Marie's first appointment as a priest was to the community of Saint Clement in Nune. However, he felt frustrated there owing to the lack of opportunity to preach as he felt he was called to do. He considered various options, even that of becoming a hermit. But the conviction that he was called to preach missions to the poor increased, and he began to think, even at this early stage, of founding a small company of priests to do this work under the banner of the Blessed Virgin. After a few months, he was persuaded to go to Poitiers by Madame de Montespan, whom he had first met in Paris. There he agreed, although somewhat reluctantly, to become chaplain to the inmates of what was known as the Hospital General, a sort of workhouse where the very poor were incarcerated in order to keep them off the streets. Here Louis Marie set about serving these poor people with all the enthusiasm which he normally reserved for such as these. In the course of his reforming efforts, he seems to have fallen foul of the authorities at the poorhouse, and around Easter 1703 he left for Paris. The next year was to be a particularly painful one for him. He first went to join the team of chaplains at the Salpêtrière, the first hospital general set up by Saint Vincent de Paul. But after a few weeks he was asked to leave. This was the beginning of a period when almost all his old friends and acquaintances rejected him. As with many other saints, it seems that his extraordinary sanctity challenged those less inclined to follow the gospel literally, and they accused him of pride and self-deception. He spent almost a year living in a very poor lodging in the Rue du Port de Fer, or Iron Port Road, without friends and without any definite ministry. This gave him the chance, however, to develop his thoughts on Jesus Christ as the manifestation of the wisdom of God, and he probably wrote his book, The Love of Eternal Wisdom, at this time, the very book well treasured by all Montfortians today. The poor of Poitiers, however, had not rejected him, and they wrote to ask him to return to them. With the agreement of the bishop, he returned to Poitiers to become the director of the Hospital General, and once again set about his reforms. He was helped in this by a young woman, Marie Louise Trichet, who felt called to be a religious and to dedicate herself to the service of the poor. Louis Marie persuaded her to come to work with him at the Hospital General, where later she was joined by another young woman, Catherine Brunet. These two, after many years of waiting, were to become the first members of the Daughters of Wisdom. Louis Marie still continued to attract opposition by his reforms, and after several more months he was persuaded by the bishop and Marie Louise Trichet to leave the hospital for the second time. He had become more and more convinced that he was called to preach missions, yet here was the bishop of the diocese forbidding him to do so. His thoughts turned to the foreign missions, but he felt he needed some higher guidance. So he set off to make a pilgrimage to Rome to ask the Holy Father, Pope Clement XI, what he should do. The Pope recognized his real vocation, and telling him that there was plenty of scope for its exercise in France, sent him back with the title of Apostolic Missionary. His extraordinary influence was especially apparent in the matter of the Calvary at Montfort. When he announced his determination of building a monumental Calvary on a neighboring hill, the idea was enthusiastically received by the inhabitants. For 15 months between 200 and 400 peasants worked daily without recompense. The Calvary of Montfort, however, was to be the cause of one of his greatest disappointments. On the very eve of its blessing, the bishop, having heard that it was to be destroyed on the orders of the king himself, forbade its benediction. The whole sorry affair of the condemnation of the Calvary was the result of jealousy and petty revenge. But the bishop evidently felt he had no choice but to curb the excesses of this extraordinary priest, and a few days later he forbade Louis Marie to do any more preaching in his diocese. This was just one, though perhaps the greatest, of the many instances where Louis Marie was called to share in the cross of Christ. He did not let it get him down, but on the contrary reflected and meditated on it, and set down his reflections in one of his short writings, the Letter to the Friends of the Cross. Although he was not banned from all work in the diocese of Nun, it was clear that if he wished to continue his preaching, he would have to go elsewhere. On the invitation of the Bishop of La Rochelle, he left Nun in 1711 and entered the last period of his life, preaching missions in the dioceses of La Rochelle and Luçon in the Wadi region of France. At La Rochelle, some wretches put poison into his cup of broth, and despite the antidote which he swallowed, his health was always impaired. Montfort now had a disciple recruited in rather unexpected manner. He was hearing confession one day when he noticed a young man praying devoutly. Moved by some heavenly inspiration, he spoke to him. He was to be the saint's first brother. His name was Mathurin Rengiet. He faithfully followed Montfort to help him in the missions, singing hymns, leading the recitation of rosary, and mainly in teaching catechism. He was called Brother Mathurin, even though he never took any religious profession. Hence, the Brothers of Saint Gabriel descended from him. The next 5 years, until his death in 1716, were extraordinarily busy ones for Louis Marie. He was constantly occupied in preaching missions, always travelling on foot between one and another. Yet he found time also to write his True Devotion to Mary and The Secret of Mary, Rules for the Company of Mary and the Daughters of Wisdom, and many hymns which he used in his missions, often set to contemporary dance tunes. He made 2 major journeys, to Paris and to Rouen, to try find recruits for his Company of Mary, of which he dreamt more and more as he drew towards the end of his life. And from time to time he felt it necessary to withdraw to a place of quiet and isolation, in the forest of Mavang, or in his little hermitage at Saint Eloi near La Rochelle. His missions made a great impact, especially in the Wadi. It has been said that one of the reasons for the vigorous resistance of the people of this region to the anti-religious and anti-Catholic tendencies of the French Revolution 80 years or so later was the strengthening of their faith by the preaching of Saint Louis Marie. Yet he found it very difficult to persuade other priests to join him in his work as members of his Company of Mary. Finally, in the last year, 2 priests, Father René Mulot and Father Adrien Vatel, did join him, and he also gathered certain number of lay brothers to help him in his work. The Bishop of La Rochelle, Monsignor Stephen de Chamflot, proved a great friend to him. Together with the bishop, he established free schools for the poor boys and girls of La Rochelle, and called Marie Louis Trichet and Catherine Brunet, who had waited patiently in Poitiers for 10 years, to come to help him. At last they made their religious profession, and the Congregation of the Daughters of Wisdom was born. Soon there were others too who joined them. Worn out by hard work and sickness, Louis Marie finally came in April 1716 to Saint Laurent-sur-Seville to begin the mission which was to be his last. During it he fell ill and died on April 28. Thousands gathered for his burial in the parish church, and very quickly there were stories of miracles performed at his tomb. The two priests of the Company of Mary, Fathers Mullo and Vatel, retired to Saint Popain with a handful of brothers, where they waited for 2 years before taking up again the mission preaching so beloved of Louis Marie. At his death, there were only 4 sisters and 2 priests with a few brothers. Today, the Montfortian family is scattered around the world. There are 2,500 daughters of wisdom, 1,100 company of Mary, and 1,200 brothers of Saint Gabriel. They continue to do the work of mercy that their founder has started. They run missions, schools, hospital, work with the slum dwellers, the deaf, the blind, the downtrodden, the marginalized, and the poor. Their motto, God alone, tells their spirituality of their totally abandonment to God's providential grace.